The waiter approached the table, discreetly, carrying a white envelope. An envelope that seemed harmless, but carried an unbearable weight. He handed it over gently, almost as if he knew he was holding a grenade about to explode. On the other side, she was smiling, adjusting her napkin on her lap, still with the expression of someone who expected nothing more than a peaceful, perhaps even romantic, evening. But that envelope was going to change everything. She looked at the waiter, intrigued, and then at the envelope. His hands shook a little as he pulled back the flap and slid his fingers inside, taking out the letter. I didn't know it yet, but that was the end of it all. The party is over. The game is over. Every word on that page was a cold, sharp blade, cutting through any hope she had of mending what was broken. When her eyes met the word divorce at the top, something inside her plummeted. What is this? He murmured, as if he didn't want to believe it. Her voice was no more than a whisper, fragile, clinging to one last thread of denial. She quickly looked around, as if looking for a way out, a way to escape what was coming. From the other side of the restaurant, he watched, sitting at a far table, strategically out of her field of vision. It was like watching a theater scene, a tragedy that he himself wrote. He watched her read every line, and every expression on her face was a bitter victory, the taste of revenge he silently savored. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just looked around in despair, trying to understand what had just happened. That wasn't the first time he imagined the moment when everything would end. The betrayal had not been an accidental discovery, it was a scar he carried for months. At first, he felt a deep, burning pain, the kind of pain that consumes every thought and every smile, turning everything into darkness. He thought he would never be able to get that image out of his head, her and another man, whispering secrets, touching each other like lovers. It haunted him, day and night, until one day, he realized there was a way to turn the tide. He wouldn't cry, he wouldn't beg for answers or try to rescue something that was already dead. He planned every detail, every movement, until you arrive at that letter, at that restaurant. Her closest friends were there, invited to a celebratory dinner, unaware that there would be nothing to celebrate. When she looked up from the letter, desperately searching for some explanation, their eyes met for a brief moment. She saw him, sitting there, watching her, and she understood. A chill ran down his spine. He had organized everything. The letter, the delivery, the location. She thought about screaming, about running to him and demanding an explanation, but she knew it would be useless. He was no longer the man she had known, the man who loved her unconditionally. He was a stranger, someone who had decided to take revenge in a way she could never have imagined. Her hands began to shake harder as she read each line, slowly absorbing the words that sealed her fate. Divorce was just the beginning. In the letter, he coldly explained how she had been removed from every part of his life. What she didn't know, what he had planned as his final blow, was written there: she would have no right to anything. No pennies, no property. He had removed her from his will, and it had not been done in haste or anger. It was a calculated, cruel decision, made months ago, when he was still trying to understand what had happened, trying to process how someone who claimed to love him could betray him like that. She tried to breathe, but it was as if the air had been knocked out of the restaurant. She felt suffocated, trapped in a web of lies that she herself had created, and that was now closing around her throat. It can't be, he murmured, his eyes teary, he can't be serious. But she knew he was. That distant and implacable look, from the other side of the room, said it all. He was tired of lies. And she couldn't hide anymore. In his head, the memories were clear and painful. Every fake smile, every affectionate touch that now seemed like a disgusting farce. He remembered the moment he discovered everything, the message on his cell phone, the poorly prepared excuses, the nights when she went out saying she needed to clear out, and he pretended to believe her, pretended not to know that she was in someone else's arms. He remembered how his voice broke when he asked her if she loved him, and how she responded with her eyes downcast, unable to look at him. She was lying to him, and he knew it. All the time. The dinner became a spectacle of public humiliation. She was there, surrounded by friends and colleagues, all watching as she slowly fell apart, realizing there was no way out. The waiter, without understanding the seriousness of the situation, continued to serve dishes and wines, as if nothing was happening. But there was something in the air, an almost palpable tension, that made it clear to everyone that this night would not be like the others. He remained where he was, motionless, watching as she fought back the tears, as she desperately tried to find some solution, some excuse that could save her dignity. But there was nothing. She was naked, exposed, her lies crumbling one by one. He had planned every detail, and he knew that this moment was the end. It was the end of love, of marriage, of the promises they made to each other. But it was also the beginning of something new for him, the freedom of a life without lies. What she never knew, what he never allowed her to find out, was that he had started planning his exit long before she realized something was wrong. He had maintained a semblance of normalcy while slowly taking away everything she could claim as hers. Bank accounts, investments, properties, everything has been transferred beyond their reach. She was going to lose everything, and he made sure of that. There was no room for negotiations, for requests for forgiveness, for attempts at reconciliation. She had made her choice, and now she would have to deal with the consequences. When she finally got up from the table, trying to maintain her composure, trying to hold back the tears that were already beginning to flow, he knew he had won. Not because he wanted her to suffer, but because he needed her to understand. He needed her to feel the same despair he felt when he discovered he had been betrayed. She took a step back, almost tripping, and her legs seemed to weaken. I wanted to scream, run, find a way to get rid of this nightmare. But there was no way. That letter was a sentence, and he had written every word to make sure she felt its impact. But deep down, as she tried to process everything, something was bothering her. Something he hadn't revealed yet, and that was about to change the entire situation. Something he had been keeping, one last piece in this puzzle of revenge and betrayal. Something that could, perhaps, be the twist she never expected. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not and will never support any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they have a clear moral, to show how betrayal can destroy lives and cause deep scars. Get ready for a shocking narrative full of twists and turns, which will keep you hooked from beginning to end. Good story and be ready for an unforgettable experience. The night was cool, and the soft lights of the elegant restaurant illuminated the room, creating a warm and sophisticated atmosphere. At one of the tables near the window sat Mark and Rachel, a couple who, at first glance, seemed perfect. Mark was a reserved man, with a strong presence and a calm demeanor. Always well dressed, he kept his beard well trimmed and his dark hair combed impeccably. His eyes were piercing, and there was something about them that conveyed a mix of calm and intensity. Mark was the type who knew how to listen, who considered every word before speaking. Working as a lawyer at a reputable firm, he spent his days dealing with contracts and negotiations, always seeking the fairest solution for all parties. He was a methodical, detail-oriented man, and these qualities also extended to his personal life. Rachel, on the other hand, was a charismatic woman, with a charming smile that lit up any room. Owner of classic beauty, she had long, wavy brown hair that fell softly over her shoulders. She was known for being extroverted, always surrounded by friends and admired for her friendliness. She worked as an interior decorator, a job that perfectly suited her keen aesthetic sense and her love of beauty in all aspects of life. Rachel seemed to be that person who had everything under control, her career, her home, and, of course, her marriage. But, behind all this charming appearance, there was a look that, every now and then, revealed something more. A restlessness. A dissatisfaction that she tried to hide with smiles and kindness. They met at a party shared by mutual friends, many years ago, when they were still young university students full of dreams and expectations. It was love at first sight. Mark fell in love with Rachel's fun and spontaneous way, the way she could make anyone around her feel special. She, in turn, admired the stability and security he offered, an anchor amid the chaos her life sometimes became. When they decided to get married, it seemed like the most natural choice in the world. They completed each other in a way that made sense to everyone who knew them. A perfect balance between sober and passionate, stable and unpredictable. The marriage began as an ideal love story. The promises exchanged at the altar seemed to be eternal, and the first years were filled with trips, romantic dinners, and plans for the future. They bought a spacious house, decorated with Rachel's refined style and Mark's practicality. On weekends, they loved cooking together, trying new recipes and enjoying the pleasure of being side by side. But, little by little, time began to change the tone of this story. Mark, with his demanding job, started putting in more hours at the office. It wasn't just the money, he wanted to grow, reach positions that until then were just distant dreams. For him, that meant ensuring a comfortable future for the two of them. Many nights he would come home late, exhausted, and the last thing he could do was sit and talk. It was easy to justify to yourself that all of this was for the good of the couple, even if it meant less time together. Rachel began to feel the loneliness of a marriage that was slowly becoming a predictable routine. She spent her days surrounded by colors, textures and projects that enchanted her, but at night, when she returned home, everything seemed to turn into black and white. Rachel was still the perfect hostess, hosting dinners for friends, smiling at social gatherings, but something was missing. She adored Mark, or at least what they represented together. But this lack of communication, this void that grew between them, made her restless. She tried, several times, to suggest a trip, a dinner out, something that could rekindle what they had in the beginning. And, on many of these occasions, Mark accepted, always willing to make an effort to please her, but it was clear that his head was elsewhere, in some meeting or problem that he needed to solve. And that's when the house, once a home full of life, started to become just a place where two people lived. Dinner conversations became shorter, and there was an awkward silence that hung in the air, as if they both knew something was wrong but no one had the courage to bring it up. Rachel felt like she was screaming inside, but she didn't know how to make Mark listen. And he, absorbed in his own world of commitments, didn't realize that something was being lost. One night, after a long day at work, Mark came home and found Rachel sitting in the living room, leafing through a decorating magazine, which had become a habit. He watched her for a moment, trying to decipher what was going on in her head, but gave up. "Hi, love," he said, forcing a smile. "Hi," she replied, with an automatic smile. "How was the day?" "Tiring," he replied, "sitting down next to you. But everything is going well." Rachel nodded, but her eyes didn't leave the magazine. She knew that "everything is going well" referred to work, to the negotiations that he was trying so hard to close. And, at that moment, she realized that she no longer knew what "everything" in her life meant to him. The nights passed like this, with brief dialogues and polite smiles, as if they were just roommates sharing a space. Weekends were a little different. Mark tried to make up for his absence during the week by organizing little surprises, like flowers on the breakfast table or reservations at restaurants he knew she liked. And for a few hours, everything seemed normal. They laughed, talked about banalities, remembered happy moments. But these attempts, however sincere they were, could not erase the distance that had been created. Rachel wished it was enough. She wanted to believe that those flowers and those dinners were a sign that things could go back to the way they were. But deep down, she knew that something essential had changed, and there were no flowers that could heal that wound. Rachel, always surrounded by people, continued to keep up appearances. Her social life was intense, and she had friends everywhere. It was difficult for anyone to imagine that behind that smile, there was a sadness that she tried to hide. Mark was discreet about his personal life at work, and rarely commented on Rachel. To his colleagues, he was just another successful, focused and dedicated man. No one knew about the silent nights, the avoided looks, the hands that no longer touched each other with the same intimacy. It was as if they had both built an invisible barrier that kept them apart, even when they were close. They knew something was wrong, but perhaps out of fear, pride or sheer inertia, neither of them dared to take the initiative to speak up. And so, the marriage that was once a perfect symphony began to transform into a dissonant melody, full of pauses and flaws that no one knew how to fix. And on that particular night, something hung in the air, unlike any other time. It was as if a silent tension was building, about to explode. Mark was silent, but his thoughts were a whirlwind, and Rachel, trying to maintain her composure, couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking a fine line and about to fall. The weeks passed, and Mark continued to dedicate himself to his work, trying to stifle the uncomfortable feeling that accompanied him every time he looked at Rachel. He knew things weren't right, but he couldn't put his finger on what, exactly, was wrong. Maybe it was tiredness, pressure at work, or just the exhausting routine of years of marriage. He tried hard to keep things the way they always were, planning small gestures of affection, but it seemed like the more he tried, the more Rachel moved away, as if she were protecting herself, hiding from him. Rachel also felt the weight of time, but in a different way. Every day it seemed more difficult to maintain the facade of happiness and tranquility. She woke up early, did her daily rituals, and when she left for work, the feeling of suffocation lessened a little. Being away from home meant escaping, for a few hours, that invisible tension that consumed her. But deep down, she knew she couldn't run away forever. Mark's attempts to reconnect only seemed to accentuate the distance between them. What once enchanted her now sounded like a distant echo of something she didn't know if she could recover. One afternoon, Mark left work early. It wasn't common for him, but he needed a break, something that would bring some relief to his busy mind. He thought about stopping by the flower shop and buying a bouquet of lilies, Rachel's favorite flowers. Maybe it was silly, maybe it was a desperate attempt, but he wanted to try one more time. As he drove through the city, he imagined her reaction, hoping that this time, a sincere smile would appear on her face. When she got home, the lights were off, but Rachel's car was parked in the garage. Strangely, she hadn't mentioned any engagements that night, and Mark found it curious that she wasn't in the living room or kitchen, where she usually was at that time. He entered and noticed that the house was too quiet. An unsettling silence that made your heart race. Leaving the flowers on the counter, Mark walked up the stairs, each step echoing in the empty hallway. He opened the bedroom door slowly, expecting to find Rachel reading or perhaps playing on her cell phone. But what he saw made the ground disappear beneath his feet. Rachel was there, but she wasn't alone. The muffled laughter he heard, the whispers that tried to be discreet, and the shock of seeing another male figure next to her in bed turned Mark's apparent calm into a violent storm of emotions. She froze when she saw him at the door. His face became a mask of panic, eyes wide, as if he was facing a nightmare he hoped he would never have to face. The man next to her, just as surprised, tried to compose himself quickly, but it was too late. Mark didn't need any further explanation, everything was there, clear as day. The betrayal, the deceit, every lie he tried not to see unfolded before him like a grotesque painting. He wanted to scream, he wanted to punch the wall, he wanted it not to be real. He felt a pulsing anger that burned in his chest, but also a deep sadness, an emptiness that sucked him in, as if he were slowly drowning. Mark wasn't a confrontational man, he never was. Maybe that's why he just stood there, staring at Rachel and the stranger beside him. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy, broken only by the sound of Rachel whispering, almost pleading, "Mark, please let me explain," but there was no explanation that could change what he had seen. Mark didn't move. He just looked at her, and in his eyes, there was something Rachel had never seen before. It wasn't anger, nor contempt. It was a frightening coldness, a resignation that she didn't know how to deal with. And then, without saying a word, he turned on his heel and left the room, heading slowly down the stairs, each step heavier than the last. Rachel wanted to go after him, she wanted to try to explain, justify herself in some way, but her legs wouldn't obey. She felt paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The man, who until then had been her escape valve, now seemed like just a stranger who needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. She asked him to go, to leave without making any noise. It was no longer time to look for excuses or explanations for what had happened. Reality had arrived, cold and unforgiving, and she knew there was no going back. Mark, in turn, left the house without a destination. The cold night wind hit his face as he walked through the dark streets, trying to understand what had just happened. Every thought was a torment, a wave of pain and anger that he didn't know how to control. He remembered the times he worried about Rachel, the attempts at rapprochement, the moments when he was sure something wasn't right but never knew how to broach the subject. And now, everything made sense, all the pieces finally fell into place, but in the worst possible way. He wandered the city for hours, trying to escape the images that wouldn't leave his head, trying to escape a pain that seemed to dig into his skin, a pain that he didn't know how to begin to heal. At some point, he stopped in a park, sat down on a bench, and stood there, motionless, staring into space, while the world around him continued to spin. But for him, time had stopped. He wanted to hate her, wanted to feel angry enough to never want to see her again, but all he could feel was crushing emptiness. When he finally returned home, it was already late in the morning, and Rachel was in the living room, sitting, as if she had been waiting for him. Her eyes were red from crying, her face was pale. She tried to start speaking, but he raised his hand, cutting her off. "I don't want to hear it," he said, in a voice that sounded strangely calm. "Not now. Tomorrow we'll talk about it." Mark went upstairs, entered the guest room and closed the door, locking it behind him. He threw himself onto the bed, feeling so exhausted that he could barely keep his eyes open. But even so, sleep didn't come. He stood there, staring at the ceiling, repeating the same questions in his mind, wondering when everything started to go wrong and how he hadn't noticed. And, most of all, how this could just be the beginning of something even worse, something he wasn't prepared to face. The sun hadn't yet fully risen when Rachel woke up. She hadn't slept well, and her tired face reflected in the mirror made it clear that the few hours of sleep hadn't been enough to erase the tension from the previous night. Mark hadn't returned to the room, and she knew the morning would bring a conversation she dreaded since the moment he'd found her with someone else. She went down the stairs slowly, feeling each step as if it were a burden, and found Mark in the kitchen, already dressed, with a cup of coffee in his hand and a distant gaze, fixed on something that only he seemed to see. Rachel hesitated before entering, trying to find the right words, but nothing seemed right. "Good morning," she said, her voice low, almost unsure. Mark looked up at her, no emotion, just a slight nod in response. He seemed to be waiting for her to make the first move, to start a conversation they knew would be painful. "Mark, she began, but he interrupted her, raising a hand, asking for silence. "You don't need to start with excuses or justifications, Rachel. I want answers. I deserve to at least know the truth." The calm in his voice was frightening. There was no anger, just a biting coldness, as if he had already accepted reality and was just dealing with the remaining formalities. She swallowed hard, feeling her throat close. "I know I made a mistake. I know that I betrayed you and, how long?" He interrupted her, and this time there was a hint of anger, a slight tremor in his voice that Rachel recognized as a sign of pain. How long had this been going on? Rachel looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "A few months," she murmured, her voice barely audible. She knew it wouldn't make the situation any less painful, but she also didn't know how to hide anything else. I didn't want you to find out like this. I never wanted to hurt you, Mark." Mark let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "You never wanted to hurt me? How exactly did you think this would end, Rachel? With me happy and content while you did what you did? I tried. I tried so hard, and all I get is this." He shook his head, trying to control himself, trying to understand how everything had gotten out of control in such a cruel way. I know nothing I say will fix what I did, Rachel continued, finally finding the strength to look at him. But I was feeling alone, Mark. I felt invisible. And he was there, listening to me, making me feel important. Mark added sarcastically. Why didn't I do that? Is that what you mean? Rachel took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure. It's not about you, Mark. It's about me. I wasn't happy, and I know that doesn't justify anything, but that's why it happened. She knew she sounded weak, that her words couldn't explain what she felt, but it was all she had. Mark was silent for a moment, letting her words echo in the empty kitchen. He knew that nothing she said now would change how he felt, the betrayal, the pain. But there was something more, something he hadn't yet revealed. He took a deep breath and took a sip of coffee, letting the bitterness calm his mind for a moment. And you think that justification is enough to get out of this intact? He asked, and his voice sounded cold, calculated. Rachel frowned, not fully understanding what he meant. Mark, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But I want to try to make things right. If there is still any chance. He interrupted her, and this time, his voice grew louder, the frustration finally boiling over. No chance, Rachel. There is nothing to save. You destroyed everything. You ruined it, and I let you believe you were in control, that you could do whatever you wanted and get away with it. He placed the coffee cup on the counter and moved closer to her, until their faces were mere inches apart. But you won't come out of this unscathed, I guarantee that. Rachel backed away a little, her heart racing. What do you mean? His expression was hard, impenetrable, and for the first time, she realized that perhaps she didn't know what to expect from him. Mark, please, I know you're hurt, but I cut you out of the will, he said, suddenly, bluntly, the words cutting through the air like a sharp blade. No right to anything. Not the house, not the joint accounts, nothing. I started the process months ago when I realized something was wrong. I just waited for the right moment to tell you. The revelation made Rachel's blood run cold. She blinked, confused, trying to absorb what he had just said. You, what? You heard, he continued, showing no emotion. While you were dating him, while you thought you were so smart, I was taking care of everything. Making sure that when the time came, you had no way of taking me down. And that moment has arrived. Rachel felt her legs weaken. It was as if the ground was crumbling beneath her feet, and she didn't know where to hold on. You can't do that. We built this life together, Mark. No, Rachel. I built it. I took care of everything. And now, everything you thought you had, is gone. He took a step back, watching her reaction, shock turning to panic. I let you wallow in your own lie, and now you're alone. She tried to say something, but her voice broke. The pain of being betrayed by him, of being betrayed by someone she thought she knew, was devastating. Mark, please don't do this. We can find a way to resolve this. Don't leave me like this. Leave you like this? He repeated, with a bitter smile. That's exactly what you did to me, Rachel. You left me with nothing. And now, it's your turn to feel what it's like to lose everything. Rachel looked at him, tears filling her eyes. For the first time, she saw the extent of the pain he was carrying, the depth of the suffering she had caused. And for the first time, she understood that he wasn't just hurt, he was destroyed. But he had also prepared for this, in ways she could never have predicted. And now, she was helpless, not knowing what to say or do to repair the damage. Mark, she began, but he shook his head, interrupting her once again. I've already decided, Rachel. There is nothing more to be said. He turned and started walking towards the door, leaving her there, alone, in the kitchen that had so often been the place of laughter and relaxed conversations, but now seemed just an empty echo. Your lawyers will receive the papers soon. And when that happens, don't look for me. We are finished. Rachel felt the world around her go dark, as if all her hopes and illusions had been ripped away at once. She wanted to run after him, she wanted to beg, she wanted to do something, anything, to stop him from walking out that door, but her legs wouldn't obey. All she could do was stand there, static, watching the person she still loved walk away, taking with her everything they had built together. When the door finally closed, silence filled the house, and loneliness enveloped her like an icy blanket. Rachel fell to her knees, tears finally flowing freely as her mind tried to process the cruel truth she had just heard. Mark had not only discovered her betrayal, but had prepared to leave her with nothing. He didn't just want to break up, he wanted her to feel, firsthand, the loss and loneliness he felt. And now, the cruel reality of what she had done finally began to sink in, making it clear that this was just the beginning of a pain that she would have to carry for a long time. Rachel remained kneeling in the kitchen, as if her legs were no longer able to support her. The weight of Mark's revelation hit her like a punch, a blow she never expected. He had been meticulous, calculating, and, above all, cruel. There was no room for an apology or a beginning of reconciliation. He had already charted the course and ensured that she was left with nothing. She thought about the last few weeks, about the nights he spent away, how silent he was when he came home. That silence that, for her, seemed like an insurmountable wall, now made perfect sense. He was planning the perfect revenge. Mark, in turn, left the house and drove for a long time, without a clear destination. He had told himself he was ready, that this was the only way to move forward. But as the car sped along the empty roads, something inside him twitched. It wasn't regret. It was the pain of realizing that revenge hadn't brought him the relief he'd been hoping for. He didn't feel the satisfaction he thought he would. On the contrary, there was a void that seemed even bigger. He parked somewhere and sat there, watching the people passing by, trying to imagine what his life would be like from then on. Everything he had planned, all the energy he had spent on making Rachel pay for what she did, didn't seem to have given the result he wanted. He was free, yes, but still a prisoner of a pain that consumed him. Mark couldn't escape the feeling that something had been lost forever, something that not even his best crafted revenge could repair. Meanwhile, Rachel finally got up. She forced herself to walk over to the couch and sit down, trying to process what had happened. It was as if the world around him had lost all color. She wanted to hate him for being so cruel, for planning every detail of her destruction. But deep down, I knew he had every right. She couldn't lie to herself anymore. Her choices had led her to that moment. And now, she was completely alone. Rachel found herself faced with a moral dilemma she never thought she would face. She wanted to fight the divorce, try to claim her share of everything they had built together. After all, it was fair, wasn't it? But the more she thought, the more she realized that this wouldn't solve anything. Going to court, challenging Mark's decisions, prolonging the dispute, all of this would only reinforce the cycle of hurt and bitterness. She was devastated, but she knew that trying to tear it apart would only make her more trapped in what she was now trying to overcome. She spent the next few days locked in the house, without speaking to anyone. I didn't have the courage to face friends, to explain what had happened. She didn't know how to say that her marriage, the one everyone believed to be perfect, had turned into a silent battlefield, where the weapons were secrets and manipulations. She thought about Mark all the time, wondering where he was, if he was okay, if he had really found any relief in the decision he made. And it was this uncertainty that tortured her. On the other side, Mark was still struggling with his own feelings. He had temporarily moved into a small apartment that he rented in a hurry. The empty white walls seemed to amplify the emptiness within him. For the first few days, he felt relieved to be away, but he soon realized that the distance wasn't enough to erase what he felt. He found himself looking at his phone several times, almost waiting for a message from her, a word that would break the silence that now existed between them. But the message never came. Rachel was also looking at her phone, her fingers hesitant, as if she knew that every attempt to speak to him would be futile. He had been clear, definitive, and that left her powerless to try. There were no more smiles to hide the pain, there were no more excuses to hide reality. She needed to face what she had done, and what it had cost them both. One day, Mark received a call from his lawyer, confirming that all procedures were underway, and that Rachel would be officially notified soon about the division of assets and the closure of joint accounts. The lawyer seemed almost satisfied, as if this was just another well-resolved case for him. But for Mark, it was confirmation of the end of an important part of his life. He hung up the phone and found himself immersed in a dilemma he hadn't expected. He wanted justice, and he felt he got it. But now, with everything moving towards the definitive closure of what was once the most important relationship of his life, he was no longer sure if he had done the right thing. Mark knew it was hard to think like that, because forgiving felt like weakness, and he refused to be weak. But revenge had a bitter taste that wouldn't leave his mouth. Meanwhile, Rachel, emotionally exhausted, began to pack her things. She knew that sooner or later she would have to leave the house, and the thought of leaving terrified her. It was like abandoning a piece of your life that you still held on to, even though you knew it was already lost. She found old photos, notes they had exchanged early in their relationship, memories that now seemed like fragments of a distant dream. And she cried, without shame, because there, alone, she no longer needed to pretend that everything was okay. But something inside her began to change. Rachel knew she couldn't move forward if she continued to hold on to the past, if she continued to live in the shadow of her own lies and regrets. She needed to accept that her actions had consequences, and that, no matter how much it hurt, the only way to truly move forward was to own what she did and accept what she lost. It was then that she made a decision. She wouldn't fight Mark. She wouldn't challenge the decisions he made, even though she knew it would mean losing everything. She needed to let him follow his own path, without strings attached, without resentment. And perhaps she too could find a way to rebuild herself, to forgive herself. Because deep down, she knew that as long as she kept trying to hold on to him, they would both be stuck with what had happened. Rachel wrote a letter to Mark, and it was the hardest thing she had ever done in her entire life. Every word was a confession, an apology, an acknowledgement of everything she had destroyed. But it was also a goodbye, an acceptance that they needed to move away to find some kind of peace. She wrote with sincerity, with pain, but also with the hope that, somehow, her words could bring a less bitter end to it all. When Mark received the letter, he was silent for a long time before opening it. He read each line slowly, feeling the pain and sincerity in Rachel's words. And for the first time, he didn't know what to do. It was as if, upon reading the letter, he could finally see what was underneath all that anger, all that desire for revenge. She was a regretful woman, desperately trying to find a way to move on, just like him. And at that moment, he realized that the ending he had planned for this story might not be what he really wanted. But the decision he made next, he knew, would be crucial. Mark read Rachel's letter more than once. Every word seemed to be written with a weight he had never seen before, a sincerity that disarmed him. He wanted to feel satisfaction, he wanted that feeling of superiority, of having won, to finally take over him. But instead, there was just emptiness. He ran his fingers along the lines, as if he could touch her pain, and for the first time since it all began, he felt compassion. It wasn't the forgiveness she might have wanted, but an acknowledgement that she was also dealing with immense pain, pain he couldn't erase even if he wanted to. Mark spent the rest of the night thinking about the letter, the decisions he made, and what he really wanted. He had orchestrated every detail to ensure that Rachel lost everything, so that she would feel the pain of betrayal with the same intensity that he felt. But now, he wasn't sure if it was worth it. He remembered a time when simply seeing her smile was enough to make him feel complete, and that memory, instead of being comforting, was almost unbearable. What had happened to them? How did they reach this point of mutual devastation? The next morning, Mark did something he hadn't planned on doing. He called Rachel and asked to meet her. When she answered, there was a hesitation in her voice, as if she expected this to be just another painful step in the separation process. But he insisted, saying he needed to see her to resolve the last issues. Rachel accepted, afraid of what that conversation might bring, but at the same time knowing that she needed to face it to move forward. They met in the same cafe where, months earlier, Mark had planned his revenge. Now, however, there was a different atmosphere. Rachel was nervous, her eyes lined with exhaustion, but there was a quiet determination in her posture. Mark arrived shortly after, and she braced herself to hear whatever he had to say. Maybe he wanted to finish destroying what was left of his dignity. But what she saw, when she looked at him, was a different man. There was a softness, a sadness that she didn't immediately recognize. "I read your letter," he said, bluntly. "And I needed to see you because I need you to understand that I didn't do this to destroy you. I did it because I was broken, and I didn't know how to deal with it anymore." Rachel looked down, tears beginning to well up, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I know I made a mistake, Mark. I know that all of this is a consequence of my choices, and I accept it. I didn't want it to end like this, with so much hate between us." Mark took a deep breath. "I don't want it to end like this either." There was an internal struggle in his words, as if he was trying to find a path between anger and forgiveness. "I'm not going back on my decision. We're going to get a divorce, and I don't think there's any way to save our marriage. But I also don't want this to be a war." Rachel looked up in surprise. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm going back on the process of taking everything from you," he explained, slowly, as if he were choosing each word carefully. "You're going to get your fair share, the house, whatever it takes for you to start over. Because I realize that, at the end of the day, that's not what's going to make me feel better. Breaking you down isn't going to fix anything." Rachel felt a mixture of relief and guilt. She knew she didn't deserve his generosity, and it only added to the pain of what she had done. "Mark, I don't know what to say." "No need to say anything," he replied. "I just want us to be able to move forward, without this weight. I want to be able to look back and remember something good. And maybe, in a while, we'll be able to do that." They were silent for a moment, and it was a silence unlike any they had shared recently. It was not filled with resentment, but with painful acceptance. They knew they would never be the same again, that the wound was still open, but they also understood that it was possible to heal. Maybe not together, but in a way that allowed them both to start again. That night, Rachel came home and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Not because there was a chance of reconciliation, but because Mark had given him an opportunity to start over, a chance to redeem himself and learn from his mistakes. She knew she would have to rebuild her life practically from scratch, but for the first time, she didn't feel the crushing weight of defeat. It was a chance to be honest with herself, to stop pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. Mark, on the other hand, returned to his temporary apartment, still feeling empty, but with a lightness he hadn't expected. He had spent months planning the perfect revenge, thinking it would bring some kind of satisfaction. But now, I understood that true liberation came from the act of letting go, It wasn't about forgetting, because he knew he would never forget, but rather about not letting the pain define him forever. He was ready to move on, and he knew that by giving Rachel the chance to do the same, he was finally giving himself the freedom he so desperately wanted. Divorce papers were signed a few weeks later, and the separation continued amicably. Rachel kept the house and obtained a financial agreement that allowed her to restart her career, focusing on smaller projects that brought her satisfaction. Mark continued his work at the firm, but dedicated more time to himself, exploring new hobbies and rediscovering things he had put aside for so long. They no longer spoke to each other after the divorce, each going their own way. But there was a silent peace that now existed between them, something that only time and difficult choices could provide. Mark and Rachel's story didn't have a happy ending in the traditional sense. There was no reconciliation, no promises of a new beginning together. But there was, yes, a satisfying ending. A recognition that sometimes the only way to move forward is to accept that certain things must end. And this acceptance brought something they both didn't expect, a sense of relief, that life can, in fact, begin again, even after the worst kind of betrayal. So, what did you think of this story? Comment below your opinion and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more impactful and exciting stories like this. Here, we will always explore the real and devastating consequences of betrayal, because we believe the truth must be told. Betrayal destroys lives. And that is exactly why we do not support, in any way, any type of infidelity. Until the next story, and thanks for following us.